is your brain on drugs and some punk rock psychiatrist. So today we're going to be talking about medication switching. Particularly, we're talking about antidepressants, so I'm going to talk about the switching of antidepressants. We've gone over all the antidepressants. We've talked about several different aspects of them. In the last episode, we went over kind of the life cycle of prescribing them, and I mentioned in that episode about switching and when to switch. And so today I'm going to go into more detail about switching. Now, you may think, oh, how hard can this be? We switch from one to another. There's actually 3 strategies to do a switch, and there's a lot of factors that go into this. I think a lot of people probably just do the cross taper for pretty much everything, and I don't recommend that. So we're going to talk about this. What are the 3 methods? So 1, you can switch drug with a washout period. That's where a drug is completely stopped and you taper off of it, you wait a period of time, and then you start another medication. All right? We'll talk about in a second when we would do this. Next, there's the direct switch, no washout. So you go from one med, you stop it, you start another one, and you're off to the races. All right? Last one, as I mentioned earlier, the cross taper. That's where we slowly come down on one med while we slowly go up on the other. All right? So those are the 3 ways to switch. And when I talk about antipsychotics, I believe there's actually 4 ways to switch. I can't remember offhand what that 4th way is, but it has these 3 ways plus another one. So there are multiple ways to switch medications. Let's talk about when we would utilize each of these 3 switching techniques. All right? So first, the washout. Stop the first drug, have a washout period, then start the new drug. Why would we do this? This seems like not a great idea, doesn't it? I mean, it seems like, man, this person needs a medication. I need to start another one. Why am I waiting? Right? So when you have a drug that can potentially interact, a washout period between antidepressants is necessary. Now, what I mostly think about here is MAOIs, right? So most of you are probably not using MAOIs or not using them very often. So this technique is not going to be employed that often. All right. But you do need to realize, go back and listen to the MAOI episode if you want more details. But there's a reason why we have a 2-week wait before an MAOI. And there is a reason why we have a 2-week wait after an MAOI, and they are not the same reason. Okay, so an MAOI, for the most part, permanently disables the enzymes for, even though the drug is gone, the effect that it has lasts 2 weeks. We have to wait until that 2 weeks to generate the new enzymes so that we can not have the dangerous interaction serotonin syndrome risk. Okay. And we want to wait on the other end 2 weeks because we need to have time for the other antidepressant to be completely gone from the system before the MAOI for a similar risk. But it's not because of the enzyme where we're disabling the enzyme. It's a different reason. So you need the 2-week washout. Exception being, we need a 5-week washout period after fluoxetine because of its very long half-life of its metabolite, and a 3-week washout period after vortioxetine. Okay, and there's probably some other ones in there. Antipsychotics that may sometimes we use antipsychotics. We haven't talked about antipsychotics yet. We're going to go into antipsychotics in depth when we go through psychotic syndromes, but I am going to go through antipsychotics a little bit because they are used to treat depression. We're going to hit that up in the next episode and the episodes after that. All right. But you also need to keep in mind that. So there may be some serotonergic activity of other medications that we need to worry about with MAOIs as well. All right. So keep that in mind. The antidepressants are not the only meds. Go back and listen to that MAOI episode, and I will go through all the meds that have serotonergic activity that you need to be concerned about. All right. So Our main concern with the washout are MAOIs. All right. So next switching technique, the direct switch. I actually really like the direct switch, and I think a lot of people don't use it. And I think what it's the advantage of the direct switch over the cross taper is that it's easier. All right. So the patient doesn't have to remember, oh man, on this week I do this med, this dose, and then this week I do this, and then this week I. The more complicated you make things for the patients, the more opportunity there is for error. If I just say, stop taking the med you're on right now and start this one and see me back, and then we'll adjust. That is such a simple thing. We can't always do it, but when we can, I think it's best to try and do that. Okay, so direct switches, it's easy for me. There's less opportunity for me to make errors in complicated. I may have to give them different doses of different meds, depending on what kind of med it is. Is this a med they could split? With the cross taper, if I needed them to split it, okay, take half of this and then take a quarter, take a whole. But maybe it's one I can't switch, so I need to give them a week's worth of one dose and a week's worth of another dose and a week's worth of a different dose. And, they've got like tons of pill bottles going on, right? So not ideal, right? So if we can get away with a direct switch, easier for me to prescribe, easier for the patient to understand, less room for error. I really like the direct switch. When can we use it? All right. So when we're going from like to like, okay, so SSRI to SSRI, SNRI to SNRI, right? If we're switching like to like, the direct switch is a good option, okay? Because essentially, think of it this way. I'm going from escitalopram to sertraline. I'm doing some serotonergic, some some serotonin reuptake inhibition, and I want to switch to a different serotonin reuptake inhibition. Basically, I'm just replacing what I did before with another one. They have slightly different, ways in which they react. Go back and listen to the SSRI episode if you want to learn more about that. But they're very close, and so we can get away with a very small change, right? It's just like increasing a dose. Can we get away with increasing a dose? Yes. In fact, if you could even change the dose, but it depends also why you're switching. So are you switching because of tolerance issues? If you're switching for tolerance issues, say we're on 50 of Zoloft, they're not tolerating it, and then I switch them to 10 of escitalopram. All right. Remember, if I'm starting it from scratch, I like to start with a half dose, 5 milligrams of escitalopram for 1 week. We don't need to do that. We're already on 50 of sertraline. We don't need to start over from scratch. Okay. That's another thing with the direct switch. You have to kind of think about your dosing. You're not going to stop the dose of one and then start the dose of the new one at the starting dose. You're going to try and find an equivalent dose, right? Because we've already started it. We already have some SRI activity going on, right? So we don't need to get them used to the side effects. They already have. Okay. Now, you might say they're on 100 of sertraline and they're having some tolerance issues. Well, maybe I do start a relatively lower dose of another med, right? And I would think 10 of escitalopram would be appropriate. And then, I think for me, I think 100 is equivalent to between 15 to 20 escitalopram. And I don't think there's any studies out there that really kind of give us equivalencies of the potencies between the doses. But the max dose of one med is not necessarily equal to the max dose of another med. And the starting, so you have to use your experience, use what you've done with other patients, but trial and error, a little bit of guesswork. We're not going to cause huge problems here because we gave somebody 5 milligrams one way or the other. Okay. They may have a little bit of discomfort for a few days, but that's going to be understood anyway when we're changing meds or adjusting doses, right? That's a risk with anything. So if we're already on one, try and pick a dose that's similar of the other one. See how they do with that one. If it's an efficacy issue, we're probably on a relatively higher dose. And if you're on a high dose, say we're on 200 of sertraline, I would maybe not do the direct switch. A max dose to a max dose, there's a little more room for error there. You could consider it, but you might want to be thinking more about the cross taper if we're on the max dose. If I'm not at the max dose, even if I'm like one step below the max dose, I'm thinking direct switch. I'm not really thinking cross taper until I get to the max when we're doing like to like. All right, so that's SSRI to SSRI, SNRI to SNRI, TCA to TCA, MAOI to MAOI, right? Actually, I think with the MAOIs, we need the washout. Sorry, I misspoke there. If you're going from an MAOI to an MAOI, you need to wash out. I believe the instructions are to wash one out before you start another MAOI. All right. So next point. What about when going from an SSRI to an SNRI? We're still on the direct switch. We're still talking about direct switch. This is also, I would consider, a like to like. SNRIs also have SRI activity. If I'm going SSRI to SNRI, I'm also thinking about the direct switch. But once again, I'm thinking about what doses are we on, and I'm considering it's a little bit more important here. Whereas I might go max dose to max dose with an SSRI, and it's case by case. But I would consider it. I would not do that with SSRI to SNRI. I would not go from a max dose or even a high dose SSRI to a high dose SNRI. Why is that? It's because we've got that norepinephrine going on. We don't want to blast them with norepinephrine all of a sudden. Okay. But if we're on a low to moderate dose, we could consider that. We don't want to start them on a huge amount of NRI activity. Okay. But if we're at a smaller dose of SSRI, we could switch directly to an SNRI and not really worry about much problem there. If we're on higher doses, I'm going to be thinking about cross tapering those. Okay. Because you just kind of have to reason through it like that, right? If I'm replacing like with like, I can do a direct switch. A low dose SSRI to a low dose SNRI is like to like, especially if I'm going to venlafaxine, which I'm not doing, but maybe you're doing. Remember, venlafaxine doesn't even begin to have NRI activity until 150 or higher, and so you could go to 150 of venlafaxine. In fact, you could probably even go to 220 or uh, I don't know, maybe a medium dose between 150 and 225, because you're not really getting that SNRI, that NRI activity. You're getting it around 150. So you could start 150 of venlafaxine after you're stopping an SSRI with a direct switch, because you're barely getting into the NRI activity at that point. All right. With something that's more balanced, like a levomilnacipran or milnacipran, you're going to be not doing that as much, right? So it's confusing, and that's why you're listening to this podcast, right? Because you want the nuance. It is complicated. That's why you get paid the big bucks, right? All these drugs work differently. Go back and listen to the episodes to remind yourself how they work. And you have to use that knowledge to know how to do the switch. So I'm going to switch differently if I'm going to venlafaxine versus if I'm going to duloxetine versus if I'm going to levomilnacipran. Okay, because I'm thinking about, when is that NRI activity kicking in? With a venlafaxine, it's kicking in at higher doses. At duloxetine, it's kicking in at lower doses. And at levomilnacipran, it's kicking in at starting doses, right? So you have to consider that, right? So if I'm in a low dose SSRI, I can easily go straight over to a low dose SNRI. If I'm at a moderate dose with venlafaxine, I can probably go from moderate dose SSRI to moderate dose venlafaxine. And I might not want to do that if I'm switching to another SNRI. Okay, so you kind of have to play it by ear. Now, the cross taper is your safest way to go. You can't really go wrong with the cross taper, except for when you need to do the washout. But when we're kind of picking between direct switch and cross taper, but I like to save time and I like to make things simple. So if I can justify and reason out a reason to do a direct switch, I'm going to want to favor that. A lot of you out there are probably thinking, I don't want to even worry about the issues with that. I'll just go through the complexities of the cross taper. And that's perfectly fine. If that's what the patient wants to do and that's what you want to do, um, there's no harm in that. But I like to try and use the direct switch when I can. Another point with the direct switch, if we're talking about fluoxetine Prozac, you want to consider waiting 4 to 7 days um, before starting the next SSRI. So it's a little bit of a washout, but it's not washed out. That's what you have to consider. It's not actually washed out because the half life of fluoxetine, norfluoxetine, is so long. We're talking about 2 week half life, so 4 or 5 weeks before it's really gone. Waiting 4 to 7 days, you still have a lot of fluoxetine in your system. You haven't washed it out. Remember, when we switch to an MAOI, we're waiting 5 weeks before we start the MAOI after fluoxetine. That's a washout. But here, waiting 4 to 7 days is a direct switch. We want to let those fluoxetine levels come down a little bit and the reason for that is because they're going to be sticking around for a while. All right. With any other SSRI, it's going to be gone within, I don't know, 3 to 5 days, something like that, right? It's going to be gone. With fluoxetine, it's going to take weeks. And so waiting a week after stopping fluoxetine and before starting your next like agent in a direct switch makes the most sense. And so we're thinking, when we're thinking about how to switch, we're thinking about half-lives. What's the half-life of the drug that we're coming from, the one we're going to? And it's most important, of course, with the one we're going from, right? Because we want to know how long that's going to be hanging out while we're starting a new agent. And we're thinking about how the drug works, the mechanism. Is this SRI? Is this NRI? Is this DRI? What all's going on here, right? And of course, when we're talking about TCAs, they have a lot of other activity with anticholinergics and histamines and alpha activity, right? So I'm not really wanting to do the direct switch as much with TCAs because of that. Now, if you're switching from one TCA that has a very similar profile, very similar alpha histamine anticholinergic activities to another one, then you could like to like, right? And if you're switching from one that has more anticholinergic activity to one that has not so much, I would be thinking about direct switch because I have no problem going from anticholinergic activity to no or low anticholinergic activity, right? But if I'm going the other way, I'm going low anticholinergic activity to high anticholinergic activity. I don't want to do a direct switch because if we're we're talking about switching, not starting dose to starting dose, but moderate doses to moderate doses. We don't want to blast them with going from almost no anticholinergic activity to a ton of it, right? um, if we're doing low dose to low dose, no real problem because that's the dose we would have pretty much started with anyway. But if we're in the medium doses, we want to think, okay, if this one has a lot more of these side effecty kind of mechanisms, and we're switching to one that has less of that, then I'm more, hey, we can do the direct switch. But if we're going the other way, we're going with something with less activity to something with a lot more activities. We're not going to want to start the one with more activities at higher doses. All right. So the main thing you're considering here is interactions. So interactions, mechanism of action, and half-lives. And you kind of have to take all that into consideration. So drug A, what's its half-life? What's its mechanism of action? What's its potential interaction with another med? And then drug B that we're switching to, what are its, and then kind of reason out what makes sense there. All right. So that's the direct switch. Let's talk about the cross taper. Okay, this is the most common method. This is what I see the most often. I actually tend to do I tend to do the direct switch most often. In my patient population that I have seen with the medications that I use the most often, I tend to be in a situation where the direct switch is what makes the most sense. I'm going SSRI to SRI, SSRI to SNRI at moderate doses. I'm thinking, yeah, the direct switch works pretty good. But a lot of people are using the cross taper. Um, we'll talk a little. I'll have an example of a cross taper, the kind of the dosing schedule on the next the next bit I talk about. But let's kind of talk about like when we're doing the cross taper. All right, so I think you can probably reason it out. When I talked about when I would do the direct, when I wouldn't do the direct is when I would do the cross taper, right? So when we're switching to an antidepressant with different mechanisms of action, all right. So say SNRI to SSRI, right? We want to take if we're on a high dose of an SNRI, we don't want to just completely lose that NRI activity all at once and go to no NRI activity, right? That's not good. Now, anticholinergic, I'm not that concerned. Histamine, a lot of histamine to like not a lot of histamine, not that concerned. Lots of alpha to not lots of alpha, because here we're not talking about we're talking about something that's causing side effects. So we're talking about something causing a side effect going to something that is not really causing any issues, right? But if the norepinephrine, it's having more of an impact on our sympathetic nervous system type of heart rate and blood pressure and things like that. You don't want to have something where the patient is adjusted to having this NRI activity and then taking it away. Because say we've given them something that could raise their blood pressure, raise their heart rate, right? We're messing with their heart here. We don't want to screw around when we're dealing with the heart, right? And they've adjusted to it and they've gotten used to it and they're not having high blood pressure and they're not having high heart rate. They've tolerated it from that standpoint. And then if you just take that away, they could get too low of a heart rate, too low of blood pressure, which could be dangerous, right? So we want to slowly come off that SNRI as we're building up the SSRI. Now, for the serotonin component, we're trying to kind of keep that the same, right? But with the NRI activity, we're trying to come off of it slowly. All right, so this would be an example of when to do a cross taper when we're trying to slowly get that NRI activity out of there. We don't want to switch from NRI to no NRI. All right, so and as I mentioned when we talked about the direct, if you're on max dose of any antidepressant, if I'm on 200 of sertraline, could I go to 20 of escitalopram? Sure, I could probably get away with that. But might I do a simple cross taper? Sure. You're going to have different cross taper situations. Um, you could cross taper one step or two or three steps, right? You might just go, okay, we'll go to 100 of Zoloft for a week, sertraline, 100 of sertraline a week, 10 of escitalopram for a week, and then stop sertraline and start 20 of escitalopram, right? A very simple one. And it's not going to be that difficult for the patient. You just say, you've got some sertralines left over. I'm sure they probably have enough sertralines left over. Cut those in half. Take half of those for a week. I'm going to give you these escitalopram's. You're going to take half of those for a week. So basically, take half of what you have now, half of the new one, and then stop the one that you were taking and take the new one. Pretty simple cross taper, right? This is a situation where did I necessarily need to do the cross taper? Maybe not, but it might make things a little bit easier, a little more comfortable. I'll just do a simple one step, 1 week, half and half cross taper. Okay. But if you're on, say, a high dose of venlafaxine, we're going to do a much longer cross taper. We're going to come off that venlafaxine one step at a time every week. And that's a lot of steps. Okay. Because we're up at 225. We're coming down, to we may come down by 37 and a half per week, maybe 75. People tend to not tolerate coming off venlafaxine that well. So you may be coming off 37 and a half at a time. It could take you a while to come down off of that. And then you're starting the next one. It could be complicated, right? Another reason why I don't really like venlafaxine, it just complicates everything. It has so many steps, so much issues with it. Go listen to the episode where I talk about venlafaxine if you want to hear me complain about it a little bit more. I wonder if there's a single episode that goes by where I don't complain about it. It's going to become like a meme for me of like I'm like overly hating on this medication that really it's really not that bad. I think it's more that like we have so many options. Why use this one? Okay, it just it's needlessly complicated to deal with, right? Can do tons of patients do well on it? Sure, they do. But do we have lots of other options where we don't have to consider so many complicated factors when dealing with it? Yeah, we do. So why pick the one that you have to deal with that stuff on? I personally choose not to. Um, so when we're switching from max to max, you can consider the cross taper, even if we're like to like, but maybe do a quick, simple, dirty cross taper. All right. Next point on cross taper. When you're switching from fluoxetine or paroxetine to a medication that is metabolized by 2D6, because they are 2D6 inhibitors, you may want to consider starting the new med at a lower dose due to that inhibition. All right. So many medications are metabolized by 2D6. Um, so you need to know which ones those are, right? Say duloxetine might be one, right? Whereas I might start duloxetine at 60 on some patients. If you listen to the SNRI active episode, I said I start 30 to 60, kind of depends on the patient. They make 20s. So if I'm going from fluoxetine to duloxetine, I may start at 20 of that duloxetine, because that fluoxetine, which once again has a long half life, is inhibiting, and it's going to be in your system for a month, inhibiting that duloxetine. So I may want, when I start that duloxetine, to have a lower dose. Okay. And if I'm switching from paroxetine has one of those shortest half lives, and fluoxetine has the longest half life, and they both inhibit 2D6, but one's going to stick around a lot longer. And so I'm less concerned about paroxetine's effects here, because it's going to be, out of the system quicker than fluoxetine. But if we're doing a cross taper, we're still taking paroxetine. So it is an issue. But once paroxetine is stopped, I'm less concerned. All right. So that may sound very confusing, right? But just remember, you need to know when you're doing this cross taper, you need to know if there's an interaction. If there is and our main interactors are, paroxetine, which honestly people don't use that much. Uh, Luvox, I mean, it interacts with freaking everything. I never use it, but if you do, it's going to interact with pretty much anything we start after it. And it also has the short half life. So we've got short half life, and it inhibits everything. Fluoxetine is a medication that is used quite commonly. I can't remember, maybe the third most common, third or fourth. I think it's sertraline is the most, and then maybe escitalopram, bupropion, fluoxetine is about the same. So it's very commonly used. So if you're switching with it to something that is handled by 2D6, you really need to take that into consideration and probably start that new med at a lower dose than you otherwise would if you were, say, switching from sertraline to that medication, because we're not having this interaction to be concerned about. So that's something that you need to realize. When we're starting that new medication, it may depend on what we're coming from, and it's SIPs, how it affects SIP enzymes. All right, so that's another important point. And it's a reason why I don't personally like to use fluoxetine or paroxetine. because why use a medication that has interactions? And especially think about the elderly population where they're taking like, 10, 20 medications, and then we're giving them a 2D6 inhibitor. Probably not the greatest idea. It's generally recommended to give escitalopram or say citalopram, but why do that when you have escitalopram? Something clean that doesn't really react with hardly anything. Some of the other medications that they have minimal interactions. They have some; those have the least. That's why I like to use them. Bupropion being the exception because it has a unique mechanism of action that has a uniquely completely different adverse effect profile, which is often much better tolerated. But I do often avoid fluoxetine because of this 2D6 inhibition. And here's an example of why. I don't think I mentioned this when I talked about the pluses and minuses. I did mention that a minus of fluoxetine is the 2D6 inhibition, but one way that that can come into play, and with the long half life, that just makes it even worse. We're inhibiting for a longer period of time, even after we've stopped the med. And so, when doing a switch, that can be a little bit more complicated. Okay. So, just keep that in mind. And the thing is, if you're not keeping this in mind and it's affecting the patient, the result might be that they have some discomfort that you may interpret as they didn't tolerate the switch. When really, it wasn't that they didn't tolerate the new med, it was that they didn't tolerate the combination that they were on while we were switching. And so maybe the new med's going to be completely fine. You're thinking, but they're not even taking this anymore. Yeah, but it was fluoxetine, long half life 2D6 inhibition. So let's give it a little bit more time before we write this other med off as them not tolerating it. But they may hate it just because this has happened in the first place, which is the reason to start that new med at an extra low dose. All right. Last point on the cross taper: avoid cross tapering with clomipramine. Probably not using a whole lot of clomipramine. If you will look at clomipramine, it has a very high serotonergic capacity. It is the strongest of the in inhibitors of the serotonin reuptake pump. And due to that, if you're going from that to another SSRI, your risk of serotonin syndrome is a bit higher just because it's so potent. And so maybe doing a cross taper with clomipramine, not the best idea. You may want to do more of a washout um, or direct switch, depending on what might make sense. And with the washout, you could now remember when we wash out, you're not with the MAOIs, you're stopping it and then waiting 2 weeks, and they're not on anything. In another washout situation, say with clomipramine, you might just taper it off, and then as soon as it's gone, we start the new medication. Okay, so you kind of have to think about the MAOI. The reason why we're waiting 2 weeks is because the effect it's had on the brain is still happening for 2 weeks after you've stopped taking the medication. With clomipramine, it's not having an effect anymore once you've completely stopped it. So we are now safe to start another medication. So you could consider the washout with clomipramine because of that. And the washout would be different. We would need as long as a washout as we would with an MAOI. All right. So that's something to consider as well. So I think a lot more complicated than maybe all of you are thinking about. Now, for your day to day with the normal med to the normal med you're going to, maybe you're not dealing with all these complexities, but every now and again you are. And if you're not thinking about half life, you're not thinking about CYP enzyme inhibition, and sometimes induction, depending on what we're talking about. You're not thinking about mechanism of action, and then you may run into some issues where the patient's not tolerating the switch very well, which you may misinterpret, as I said, as not tolerating the new med when really it was the switching process that they didn't tolerate. So lastly, I just wanted to kind of go over a brief cross-tapering strategy. In this example, we're on venlafaxine XR 150 milligrams a day, and we want to switch to escitalopram 20 milligrams a day. All right, so or say we're actually on a higher dose of venlafaxine. Okay, say we were on, what's 37 and a half in addition to 150, that would be 187.5. So we're stepping down by 37 and a half, going down to 150, starting escitalopram 5. That's week. We do that for a week. Second week, um, they're saying go down to 75 of venlafaxine, up to 10 of escitalopram. Week 3, stopping venlafaxine and doing escitalopram 20. You know, when I'm talking about venlafaxine, I'd like to go down by 37 and a halves. If I could go down even slower than 37 and a halves, I would. I don't know if I'd want to go down by 75s. That's a bit, for me, that's a bit much. Um, However, if you are starting now, if we were discontinuing venlafaxine and not starting a new med, I definitely want to go slow. All right. But since we're adding an SSRI on top of it, that's going to mediate some of those discontinuation syndrome effects of the venlafaxine. And so perhaps you could go at a pace where you're going down by 75 at a time. But, when I gave that example of the cross taper between, say, escitalopram and sertraline, that was a quick two-part switch. Here we had a three-part switch. We were on 225 in venlafaxine. We went down to 150, added escitalopram, went down to 75, upped escitalopram, went down to stopping venlafaxine, and then up to the dose of escitalopram. So it took us a few steps there. All right. So, and you've got to play it by ear. If a patient's tolerating it really well, you can go this quick. If they're not and they're calling, oh, I feel like garbage, let's readjust. We don't necessarily have to do the switch weekly. We could do it 2 weeks. We could do it a month if we have to. We could go down and up by smaller increments. So after you see how the patient's responding, you may want to change course. Now, for the most part, doing this whole thing is not going to cause harm to the patient other than some discomfort. And so if it doesn't go as planned, the worst that's going to happen is a few days of discomfort for the patient. Not ideal, but not dangerous. Okay. Now, there are ways where that could be dangerous. Say you make them extra irritable and then they become violent and hit their spouse, and then the police are called. That could happen, right? You Someone could become irritable because of too quick of a discontinuation. They could have a violent outburst that could lead to some problems. So I don't, from a medical standpoint, they're not going to be in the hospital or die or have organ failure because we change their meds in the inappropriate way. But when we're messing with their mood, we are, they're going to have changes in behavior that they would not have otherwise had, and those changes may have some serious consequences. You know, it could affect the way they drive. It could cause them to get in a car accident. Could cause them to be sleepier and more reckless and not pay attention to something, have an accident, not attend to something like a baby that maybe they needed to do, right? So it may not have like a bodily health effect, but it's going to have external kind of behavioral effects, right? So uh, you know it's not going to kill you, but it could lead to serious consequences. So I think that's important to keep in mind. All right. So hopefully, you feel comfortable with the switching. I know a lot of that sounded probably really complicated. I don't want to go over it and over and over it. Go back and listen to it if you need to. Um, if you've got if you've got questions, I've got an email address. I've gotten no emails up to this point. I have an email address, contact@punkrockpsychiatrist.com. It's on my website. If you have a question, send it in. I'll answer your question on the next episode that I record. I will send you a response. Okay, so if you're confused by something that we're talking about, And I could easily see how that's the case. I kind of think, should I just assume that people are going to understand this and move quickly because they don't want to listen to me ramble on, or do they need a slower, longer explanation? And the answer is it depends on how comfortable the listener is with the content. Some people are very unfamiliar. There may be patients listening to this that have very little familiarity with what's going on. There may be people that have been practicing for years that have a lot of familiarity, that are just picking up a couple of pearls here and there. And so we do have a variety, hopefully, in the audience. And we have people, I've got listeners in different countries. Some of them are not English speaking countries, and so they may not understand things quite as well. So if you didn't get what you needed from the episode, please send that in, and comments, questions, whatever. I'm very happy to clarify. I want this to be an education platform that we can all learn from. And if you find something that was incorrect, or you think I made a mistake, please point that out. We're all learners. I'm learning. I would love to learn from something that you have to say. I've tried to do as diligent of research as possible when putting these episodes together, but I can't do it as good as I'd like to. Which would be perfect. Can't be perfect. So anyway, that brings us to the end of the switching episode. I'm going to do the augmenting episode. I may release these at the same time. They are a bit shorter. I don't know. It ended up being a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, which hopefully that's helpful. So please like, subscribe, and tune in next time to find out about augmentation.